So the heatwave is finally over, and hopefully that was the last heatwave of this year. We've even had some rain, which is why these fields are a little bit greener than they were last week. But this isn't the end of the drought. By no means. In fact, water levels are still abysmally low.
The rain we've had is better than nothing, but nowhere near enough to get everything back to normal. Besides, the damage to this year's harvest is already done. Time now to talk about what kind of an impact this weather has had.
It's been a challenging summer, to say the least. We've had some really bad ones before, but this is the first time I could ever remember temperatures of 40 degrees Celsius, and that in a country that until now hasn't really needed air conditioning, at least not in private homes. But of course, while the heat was brutal, the worrying part was the lack of rain. This part of the world should have lush green pastures all year round. When you step out onto your lawn, it should not go crunch. Some species of tree are also visibly suffering, and just generally, it looks as if this year's harvest is in serious trouble. Under these circumstances, cereal crops just stop growing and ripen early. This is an emergency response. The grasses want to reproduce before they die.
The result is not just an earlier harvest, but because the grains are so much smaller, the harvest is also smaller. Germany's farmers are expecting to harvest about 7% less grain than they did last year.
That doesn't sound like much, but it is enough to push food prices up. And it gets worse because different parts of the country have been affected by the drought in different ways. The north has not felt the effects nearly as much as the south. In southern Germany, things have got so bad that farmers are facing the prospect of having to slaughter some of their livestock because they simply cannot feed it. If not enough grass is growing, cattle have to be fed on hay. But if not enough grass is growing, there's not enough grass to make hay. And then there were the wildfires. Almost all of them started by people, either through carelessness or, and this is something I will never understand, deliberately. Now, we were very fortunate in that we weren't directly threatened by any fire, but there were quite a few relatively small ones uncomfortably close. In fact, a few days ago, a weather phenomenon called an inversion meant that smoke from these fires couldn't go up. So instead, it spread out at roughly nose level. That's right, we could literally smell the wildfires, and the emergency services in our region had to ask people not to report a fire unless they could actually see smoke or flames. There is one small advantage though. At least living out here, we're not surrounded by asphalt, concrete and glass, creating urban heat islands. There are for sure many disadvantages of living out here in the countryside, but it is a couple of degrees cooler.
It's a small comfort, and I'll take as much comfort as there is before this video descends into a bottomless pit of doom and gloom. I realise I may not sound like it at the moment, but I am an optimist at heart.
Even though it is sometimes quite hard, when you hear on the news about rivers like the Rhine and the Danube drying up to the point that ships can no longer navigate them, it's hard not to feel a sense of panic. Not that this won't impact us, of course it will. There is the basic ecological disaster in and of itself, but also if ships can't navigate the Rhine, that's a real problem, because that is how we get petroleum down into the south of Germany. Which means that, especially if you live in the south, it's going to become more expensive to refuel your car. Again. Unless you have an electric car, in which case you can reap the benefits of solar power in relentless, unceasing sunlight. But on top of all of this, we've been bombarded by headlines saying that in Germany the heat has killed thousands, indeed tens of thousands of people. However, we really need to get behind the headlines and think about what's actually being talked about here. These figures come from the Robert Koch Institute, but they don't directly refer to the number of people dropping dead from heat exhaustion. Rather, they're talking about excess mortality. How many more people die in a given period of time than you would normally expect?
For example, the RKI calculates that during the worst heatwave in the last week of June, there were a little under 10,000 more deaths than normal for the last week of June. But in the vast majority of cases, these are elderly people who were already sick. The heat basically worsened their conditions.
That is to say, without wanting to get too morbid about this, many of them would have died by the end of the year anyway. This isn't about the sun wiping out our older generations, it's about the lack of air conditioning in hospitals and care homes. In fact, according to the Federal Statistical Office, while that last week in June did see 32% more deaths than normal, the figure for the whole period from April to June, including that heat wave, were roughly in line with the 4-year median. If anything, slightly lower. For whatever reason, and I'm guessing the mild winter played a role here, fewer people than normal died in April, and in fact, fewer in March. That's not to say that there isn't a problem, there absolutely is, but it is important to keep these things in perspective. At times like this, we naturally turn to the government for help. So, what is the government doing? And is there actually anything the government can do? Unfortunately, the current government is split on the issue, partly on ideological grounds, and is spending its time arguing about net zero and whether or not to subsidise air conditioners. And this is the point where the German model of consensus politics, with governing coalitions as the default, starts to break down. And yes, I do think that we absolutely have the right to expect better of our elected representatives, but we also need to recognise that the government is in a no-win situation here. Take, for example, fuel, particularly for cars. One of the biggest driving forces behind climate change is believed to be our use of fossil fuels. And so the government is under fire for not encouraging people to give up their old petrol-guzzling cars in favour of electric vehicles. But at the same time, the moment the price of fossil fuels goes up, the government comes under fire for not doing enough to make fossil fuels affordable so that people can continue to drive their old petrol-guzzling cars. Contrary to popular belief, Germany is actually making pretty good progress away from fossil fuels and towards renewable sources. Maybe not as much progress as some people would like, but progress nonetheless. And yet the country is also seen as failing to take advantage of the AI revolution, an industry that requires the construction of data centres that consume impossible amounts of energy, much faster than we can build the wind turbines that would be necessary, not to mention all the water they consume. But I don't want to end on such a pessimistic note. Now, I don't buy the idea that climate change is not a thing. The evidence is overwhelming. The statistics paint a very clear picture. But I also don't buy the idea that this is the end. I haven't yet seen any serious scientists predicting the end of the human race. To be sure, we have had devastating famines in the past. History books are full of them. And in fact, at one point, famine was a major factor in the European witch hunts. The issue now is that they're happening more often. But we survived. And we also survived events like the Black Death, and I think this is going to be something similar. It is going to be absolutely awful to live through, and I don't expect that I'm going to see things get better within my lifetime. But I am very certain that our descendants will be fine in the long run. We need to do two things. First, we need to find out ways of making sure that we don't make things worse than they already are. And second, we need to adapt to a new reality. And I think the human race can do both.
Thank you for watching, and this video has been an experiment. Let me know in the comments what you think of this style and whether you'd like to see me leave my studio more often.